So you're struggling to learn subnetting. Well, that's okay, my friend. By the end of this video, you're going to be a master at it. Without further ado, let's dive in. Well, if I had to pick the most difficult thing to learn for your career in cybersecurity, it would be subnetting. It is an extremely difficult concept, but it's worth taking the time to learn, and it will make you a much better cybersecurity professional in general if you take the time to learn it. So let's start talking about what layer does the IP address live on and what does an IP address look like. So we can see here that IP addresses live on the network layer, which is layer 3 in the OSI model. And this is what an IP address looks like. So we have 192.168.0.1. This is a pretty typical standard IP address that you'll usually see when you're doing networking and one that you should expect to see in your career. And this is what an IP address would look like in binary. Now, I'm showing you this now because it's important to know that as we dive further into this, you're going to have to switch back and forth between binary and decimal, especially when it comes to subnetting. So I give you this early on because it's important to understand just kind of your basics around IP addresses and how they're built. So you have your 4 octets, and each one of these 4 octets is made out of 8 bits. So you have 8, 16, 24, and 32. And each one of these bits can be turned on or off. So right here, let's take a look at 192. So we have 128 turned on and we have 64 turned on. If we add those two numbers together, we get to 192 right here. And so the rest are turned off. We use a 1 to denote that it's turned on. We use a 0 to denote that it's turned off. And the same thing here, a 168 address means that we have 128. The easy way to do this is to go ahead and take 168 and then subtract 128 from it, the largest number that would go into that, right? And then you would figure out from there that 64 can't go into that. Then you take 32, and then you find out that 16 can't, so then you move up to 8. And then that's how you arrive at 168 if you're going to go ahead and switch the bits on for this number. 0 means none of the bits are turned on right now, and 1 means that just this last bit here. We always go from left to right whenever we take bits away. We never go from right to left. So this is what it ends up looking like in the end, where you end up having 11.0.0.101.010.000.0000000000001. And that's what an IP would look like in binary. However, we don't talk like that, so we're going to just go ahead and stick to 192.168.0.1. Every device on your network gets assigned an IP address, usually through DHCP, or Dynamic Host Configuration Protocol, which is usually built into your router if you're at home or in a small office, or running on a separate server if you're in a larger corporation or enterprise environment. It's important to note that you don't have to use DHCP and can assign IP addresses manually or statically, which is useful when you don't want a device to change its IP in case you need to troubleshoot it later for some reason, such as a server. It's also important that a device gets its own IP address because if it didn't get an IP, it would be like if you're at home waiting on a package to get delivered, but the mailman doesn't know where to deliver the package to, so it never gets delivered to you. Your computer would be doing the same thing. Likewise, if you're trying to send a package to somebody else, if you don't have an IP address to where it needs to go and where it's originally coming from, the post office can't send it. Networking is based on that same principle. Let's focus on this. A short history lesson. Back when IP addresses were first created in 1983, the guys who came up with that did a lot of thinking on how this thing needed to work. As I mentioned when I brought up about there being 8 bits per octet, they decided to go with 32-bit address spaces, which means 2 to the 32nd power. This was fine in 1983 because not many people had computers back then. So when they did the math, they figured that about 4.3 billion available IP addresses would be enough for everyone, whoever wanted a computer. Because we have a lot more people than this on Earth, and each of us has multiple devices, it quickly became apparent that we needed more IP addresses for everyone's devices. IPv6 is the long-term answer to this dilemma because it uses 128-bit address spaces, giving us astronomically high number of IP addresses to work with, 340 undecillion. That's a lot bigger than an IPv4 address that we have currently. Even though this is really impressive, What we're used to working with in networking and cybersecurity is the short-term answer, which brings us to CIDR, and then ultimately to NAT. CIDR stands for Classless Interdomain Routing, which is a technical way of saying that it is the way that we allocate our IP addresses for routing data. NAT, or Network Address Translation, allows IP addresses to exist privately inside of a public IP address for your network that is defined by your ISP, or Internet Service Provider. Your device is using a private IP inside of your home or business network. Then your default gateway is usually just your router, or for large enterprise network instances, a firewall will translate the local IP to the public IP and then route the traffic to its appropriate destination. For even larger NATing, we would use PAT, which is Port Address Translation. I'm not going to dive very deep into that here because I haven't come across it very often in my own career, and it goes beyond my intentions of this video. But for a really great explanation on how this works in detail, I encourage you to go out to Professor Messer's YouTube channel and see his explanation, which I'll link to in the video below. Because of NAT and the fact that your private IP turns into a public IP, it is vital that you use a VPN when you're online. VPNs make it so that your traffic is encrypted and routed through a remote server, so your real IP address is never visible to any of the websites and services you visit. If a VPN isn't enough for your needs, you can also consider some emerging trending technologies that go beyond what a VPN is capable of, such as a ZTNA, or Zero Trust Networking Access. This would be more beneficial to a larger enterprise network where you need to worry about more highly confidential data. A good example of a ZTNA would be Zscaler, and I'm not endorsing their product, but I do think that they are a very reputable company and they do have good products. There are tons of ZTNAs out there. Zscaler just happens to be the one that I know about in my own experience. There are 3 big IP addresses your device needs to have in order to communicate properly on a network. Number 1, its own unique IP address. Number 2, a subnet mask, so that the device can figure out what subnet it's on. It's also extremely useful for you when you troubleshoot to see how many hosts are on a particular network. All a subnet mask is the number that divides your main network into smaller segmented networks. This mask helps you to know which parts of the network it's on. And number 3 is your default gateway. This is the device that allows your device to communicate outside of the subnet it's on. Why do we subnet? Well, there are too many devices in the world and we can't manage them all at one time. By subnetting, we're organizing all of our devices and subdividing those devices into more manageable sub-areas. And so that these smaller networks make up bigger networks, and then even bigger networks, and then even bigger networks to make up the internet. And so in our world, the internet is just made up of a ton of different smaller, more segmented networks. Now let's talk about important subnet components. Your network address is always going to be the first IP address of your subnet, and then in a .0. Your first usable address is always one number higher than your network address. Your broadcast address is always going to be the last IP address in your subnet and is always going to end in .255. Your last usable address is always one number lower than your broadcast address. Some special IP addresses that we need to cover are your virtual IP address. Usually you're going to see these kind of virtual IP addresses whenever you're using a virtual machine, such as VMware or VirtualBox. Number 2 would be a loopback address. This is an address that reflects back to your own device. Usually you'll see this as 127.0.0.1, but it can be changed to be anything from 127.0.0.1 to 127.255.255.254, and reserved addresses, such as your Class E addresses. Now that we know all about that, how does a MAC address play into any of this? Well, when you send a packet out over a network, that packet includes the MAC address of your device as well as your device's MAC address. This helps ensure the device is going to the correct address. Think about your mailing address. In my case, my mailman can see, well, Sean Wolfslegel lives at this address. I would be like the IP address because I could sell my house and I'd no longer be the resident at this address. However, wherever I go, I'm still Sean Wolfslegel. My address number, 123 somewhere lane, would be like the MAC address because it's not going to change. It's always going to stay that same number. Unlike my analogy, however, in computer networking, MAC addresses can be spoofed, even though a house cannot. So it's important to know that a malicious device trying to intercept the packet or trying to connect over a network can spoof a legitimate MAC address. Remember that IP address from earlier? Let's dig into that a bit further. This is what a terminal usually looks like. And so you'll normally, if you're in a Kali machine, if you're a cybersecurity professional, and especially if you're on Red Team, you'll find yourself in Kali a lot. So you have your username at your box, and then you have this little tilde, which will signify that you're in the home folder. And then you go ahead and have a simple command like ifconfig. Now, ifconfig is going to come up with a lot more information than what I have here, but I just narrowed it down to the important parts. So you have your device right here, which in this case is Ethernet 0, and then you have your iNet, which is your IP address. This is the subnet you're on, and then you have your broadcast address. This is the last available IP address in your address block. So let's talk some more about bits. So bits are, when we turn something on, we're going to go ahead and start to see the power of 2s here at play. The power of 2s is really important when it comes to subnetting because you're going to start to see, as we go ahead and turn bits on, we're losing some of our hosts that we would actually have, but this would allow us to further segment the network. So let's just take a moment and see how this goes. So whenever we turn our bits to a 0, you see we start to gain hosts. And hosts are just the amount of devices you can have on a particular subnet. So in this case, this would be a WAC 28, and then you have 240. In this case, you're going to have 256 hosts in the end. Now, let's focus a little bit more on the different subnets. So these are typical subnets that you're going to see. You have a Class A, a Class B, and a Class C. So with a Class A, you have your first block is your network block, and then you have your hosts. All of these zeros means that any of these could be a host. So this gives you a lot of hosts, but not a lot of network. And then as we move down, we start to see that go through some more. So where we have a network of these two first octets are filled in, and then we have about an even number of hosts to an even number of our network. And then with a Class C, we have 24 bits filled in, and then we have only 8 bits left over for our host. For a Class A, we have 8 bits for our network, but we have 24 bits left for hosts. For a Class B, we have 16 bits taken up for our network, but we have 16 hosts, so we're evenly dividing that. And then we have 24 bits taken up for our network, but we have 8 bits for our host. This just means that there's a lot more Class C networks than there are Class A networks. We can build up a lot of Class C networks with a few number of hosts, or we could choose to go ahead and do the opposite, which would be to do a Class A, and we can have very few networks, but with a lot of hosts. This would be for something like Google. This would be something for your home address. So these are important to know, and these are going to help you out in the long run. Just know that Class A addresses always start with anywhere between a 1 to 127. An example of this would be 10.0.0.1, and you can see here that the 10 is going to fall between the 1 and the 127. A Class B address is always going to start with either a 128 through 191. And again, you can see here, this is going to start 172 is going to fall right in the middle of 128 and 191. And Class C is 192 to 223. So we can see here this 192 is right here. So we're in a Class C address. Some more important points that would help you out is knowing your public IP address ranges and your private IP address ranges. So your public IP address ranges for Class A, 1.0.0.0 to 127.0.0.0. Class B is 128.0.0.0 to 191.255.0.0. Class C is 192.0.0.0 to 223.255.255.0. I'm not mentioning Class D and Class E addresses because Class D and Class E addresses are special circumstance addresses, and we're not going to spend a whole lot of time focusing on them because you're not going to see them too much in your career as a cybersecurity professional, unless you're doing a very specialized job role. So with private IP addresses range, this is where we really want to focus in because these are going to be what you're going to see most often. You're going to have a 10 dot address to a 10.255 address and a 172.16 address to a 172.31 address. And again, this is probably the most common thing you're going to see out there is a 192.168 address out to a 192.168.255.255. Earlier, I was saying about how when you go from a class A to a class C, you start to gain more networks, but you lose the amount of hosts, and then vice versa. Whenever you go from a class C to a class A, you have fewer networks that you can build out with that, but you're also going to get a lot more hosts. So class A is really useful to like a larger enterprise organization like a Google or a Netflix or something like that. And so you can have just a few number of networks here, but you can have a ton of hosts on each subnet that you have. Class B kind of falls right in the middle of that. So maybe you have like a medium-sized corporation, and then you do this where you have 65,534 hosts, and that gives you still a lot, right? But it's not 16 million. And then for here, you have a class C subnet where you have 2 million networks, but you only have 254 hosts per network. And you can think about your home address, which is usually a 192.168 address, and usually you just have 254 devices that you can put on that. Now for some math. So what if we want to know how many remaining hosts are available in a subnet? Well, we have this handy formula here. This formula is how we calculate how many remaining hosts are available in a subnet. So you can see here that remaining host addresses is equal to 2 to the power of 32 minus the subnet mask. And this is in parentheses because you need to know that you have to put this number, whatever this number ends up being, in here and then subtracting 32 minus that number. So we have 32 possible available bits in our octets for our IP address. And then we have, as an example, I put 255.255.255, which is a pretty standard class C address, which would give you 24 bits on. So we take the 32 minus the 24, and then we go ahead and subtract the 2. We'll dig into it a little bit further here on this screen. Let's say we have an IP address of 172.168.0.1 with a WAC 24, and the subnet mask is 255.255.255, which will give us 24 bits. Now in here, you can see our remaining host addresses is equal to 2 to the 32nd minus 24 power minus 2, and that ends up giving us remaining host addresses of 254. There's easier ways to do this. I'm going to get into that in a moment because these are very complicated ways. Let's try another example. Let's say we have an IP address of 10.0.0.1 WAC 8. The subnet mask is 255.0.0.0, and so we have 8 bits here that are turned on. So we would say our remaining host addresses is 2 to the 32nd minus 8 power minus 2, and so we're left with 16,777,214 host addresses available. Now let's say you're asked on a test, what subnet does this address belong to? 192.168.0.33 WAC 27. How would you figure this out? So this is a little bit more complicated, and there's going to be shortcuts that are coming up. But first, we note that there's a WAC 27 here. Then we apply the remaining host addresses formula to determine the block size. So we'll go ahead and say 2 to 32 minus 27 power, which gives us to the 5th power, which gives us a 32-bit block size. And we don't subtract 2 like we did in the last slide where we would subtract 2. We need to know the full block size in order to know where our subnet exists. The third step would be count up from 0, and so we count up from 0 in the 4th octet in the block size to determine the subnets. So we say subnet 1 is 192.168.0.0 to 192.168.0.31, right? And then the next one would be 192.168.0.32 to 192.168.16.63. Why? Because we have 32-bit block sizes, so we're counting up from 0 in the 4th octet, right? So because we want to know where this exists at, so we say 192.168.0.0 starting place, and now we know that this is our first IP, and then we take it up 32 bits up from there, so then that gives us 31, so that's subnet 1, right? Because that's all you can fit in a WAC 27. And now we go to 192.168.0.32, and then to 192.168.16.63, which is another 32 bits for our block. And then that would be your answer. This is where the subnet exists. Again, this is all very complicated because the math is not easy, but I just want you to see that this is one way to do it. If you're math-minded, maybe you're picking up on this better than I did. Math is not my strong suit, so I always struggled with this. but there's easier ways to do it. So what if you want to know how many subnets you can make? There's a formula for that also. A formula to calculate how many subnets you can make is the number of subnets is equal to 2 to the number of bits borrowed. And you'll see what that looks like here in a moment. So your number of subnets is 2 to your number of bits borrowed power. Let's say you start with a network address of 192.168.0.0 WAC24. Pretty standard Class C address here. So you decide you want to create 2 subnets from this. So you borrow 1 bit from your available bits. So 192.168.0.0 WAC24, which we got from here. And then we know a WAC24 is 255.255.255.0. So we'll go ahead and come to our actual bits and we'll say we have 8 bits here that are turned on, 8 bits here that are turned on, 8 bits here that are turned on. Now we want to go ahead and borrow this bit. And then what you'll do is when you borrow that bit, you turn it on and then you end up with this. So you're going to go ahead and move this up to a WAC25, and then this is going to be 192.168.0.0 WAC25, and then you want to do 192.168.0.128 WAC25. So because you're going to get, when you turn this on, you're going to get 128 bits. So because you have 128 and then you have 64 and then you have 32, if you're thinking about this in your mind, how all these bits are placed, so you get the 128 bits. So 0 to 127 for this one, and then you do a 128 to 255 for your next one. And now we're going to talk about the easy way, which is the way I prefer to do things. So this is what you should remember out of all of this. And essentially what you have here is this is a basic cheat sheet. There's a more complicated one coming up, and this is probably the best cheat sheet that exists. So you have a 255.0.0.0, which is your class A right here. And then you have 255.255.0.0, and then that's your class B addresses. Because, right, these are, each one of these is a bit, right? So this is your first octet, this is your second octet, this is your third octet, and this is your fourth octet. So 255.255.255.0 for this one, and then this one here is whatever it ends up being, 255.255.255, and then whatever, 128, 192. The way we get there is here we have our hosts. So we are only focused on this last row here for this, where we have 1, and then we double it, and then we get 2, and then we double it again, and then we get 4, right? So for a WAC 30, we would get 4, and then for a WAC 29, we would have 8. It's WAC 28, we'd have 16, right? And so the beauty of this is all of these, this chart here, this subnet chart is going to be really handy for you on an exam, because if you can memorize all of this, then you can answer almost any question, because I'll show you why here in the next few slides. But essentially your subnets are going to be 128 anytime you have a WAC 1, 9, 17, 25. And then you have a 192 subnet anytime you have a WAC 2, 10, 18, or 26, and so on. Now we arrive at this, if you're taking an exam and you have to remember things, the easy way to do this is you have 128, 128. These are always going to be right here, right? And then you take an add 64, you get 192. You add 32, you get 224. You add 16, you get 240. You add 8, you get 248. You add 4, you get 252. 2, 254, 1, 255. And this will come in handy so much for your exams. It's super helpful. But let's get into it. Let's explain why it helps out so much. This is the bigger version of it. And so we can see here, the only thing we've done is we did the same exact thing that we did in the last one. The only difference is we've actually separated them out this way, where we're actually looking for the replacing the appropriate subnet mask. But we've just taken those same exact ones that I showed you on the bottom row here, put them in each host. And you can see here, we continue it up. So we have 128, then we go to 256, 512, 1024, 2048, 4096, and so on until we get to this last number here, right? So as long as you have these two rows figured out, you have everything you need to go ahead and pass a networking exam. So let's talk about a practice problem. Let's talk about real world. We have an IP of 192.168.0.0 WAC24. and we're asked, what is our subnet mask? How many hosts do we have available to use? What is our network address? And then what is our broadcast address? So the way we figure this out is we would have our subnet mask, which is 255.255.255.0 for a WAC 24. And if we come back here and you see here, WAC 24, we know we're going to have 255 right here because this whole block is taken up. We're going to have our whole block here taken up, so that's 255. And so we're left here to WAC 24. We look down here, 255, right? 255, 255, 255, right? So that's how we know our subnet mask. Now our number of hosts, how do we get that number? We come back to our chart again and we say, okay, so I have a WAC 24 and I know I need to have how many hosts I have. The way that you do that is, you know that at this level here, you have 128. You would go ahead and double that number here at the 24. And so when you double that number, you're going to be left with 256. And then you're going to subtract 2 for your network address and your broadcast address, and then you're left with 254 hosts. And then our network address is going to be that first address. It's always our first address, so 192.168.0.0, right? And then our broadcast address is 192.168.0.255, right? Because why? Because 256 minus 2, this is the first part of the minus 2, and then this is the second part of the minus 2. It's going to be our last address in our available address block here for a WAC 24. Practice problem 2. Again, so 192.168.0.0 WAC 27. Now, this one's a little bit trickier because we're not talking about a WAC 24, which is our easy one. We're talking about a WAC 27. Again, how did we get to this? How did we get to our subnet mask, 255.255.255.224? How did we get to 224? Well, let's go back here a minute. WAC 27, we know that we have 224, right? We line it up. We know that that's it right there. Perfect. And we would say, now how do we know how the number of hosts is 30? WAC 27, all right? So these 3 bits are switched on. So now we have to take and figure out how many bits we have left. Now the beauty of this host is this last row also works as your bits for an IP address, because you have an IP is 8 bits, and you have 128, 64, 32, 16, 8, 4, 2, and 1. So all you would do is you look at this, you say, okay, I know that these 3 are already turned on, so I have this many remaining. So you just count the ones that you have remaining, and you have 28, 29, 30, 31, and 32. So you would say 16 plus 8 plus 4 plus 2 plus 1, and then that gives us 30 host addresses, right? Because we're going to subtract 2 from that number, and then we're going to have our network address, which is 192.168.0.0, and then 192.168.0.31. All right, practice problem 3. What is our subnet mask here? How many hosts do we have? What is our network address, and what is our broadcast address? Well, we have 10.10.0.0 WAC 20. I'm going to give a few minutes here for you to go ahead and figure this out, and then I would suggest pausing the video at this point, and then as you pause the video, try to work through it in your own head, and then we'll go ahead and continue. We have WAC 20 is 255.255.240.0. Our number of hosts is 4094. Our network address is 10.10.0.0, and our broadcast address is 10.10.15.255. This one I want to show you how we ended up getting this .15 here. This is important. So when we talk about the broadcast address, we're going to go back again, and we're going to say we know we're at a WAC 20. So because we know we're at a WAC 20, we know these first four bits are turned on again, and then we take our 8, our 4, which is 12, our 2 is 14, and our 1 is 15. So we know that this is 15, right? We know that because we have those, we can come back here, and we can say that 10.10.15.255 is going to be our broadcast address, because we don't need to focus on this last one. We only needed to focus on this one right here because we're working out of a WAC 20. So because we're out of a WAC 20, we're only focused on this third octet, this row here. This one's going to automatically be a 255 because it's the last one. And then our practice problem 4, again, 172.16.0.0 WAC 18. Give you a few minutes to go ahead and try to figure this one out on your own, and then we'll go ahead and continue. So we're left with a subnet mask of 255.255.192.0. Our number of hosts is 16,382. Remember, we subtract 2 here for our number of available hosts. Our network address is going to be 172.16.0.0, WAC 18, right? So we're going to start off with that first address, right? And then our broadcast address is going to be 172.16.63.255. Now, these are going to be some things we have coming up in the future, and I certainly hope that you join us for it because I think it's going to be really helpful for you to understand these networking ideas. We're going to start getting into more technical details and how things can really help you out in the real world, and so I certainly hope you join us for that. So this is the last thing I want to show you here, which is our IP address guide. And so we can say here we have anything where we want to convert a CIDR to an IP range, and then we can go ahead and calculate that out. And so it'll give you the information right here. Now, most of us in networking, we would just use something like this because it's a lot easier to go ahead and do all this math using a calculator. But it's important to know these things for an exam, and also just because if you're talking with networking professionals, you want to know, things like what is your broadcast address, what is your network address, and how do these things work. So because of that, I wanted to show you the hard way to do it and then show you the easy way. My last recommendation would be to go ahead and go out to the Cyber Mentor and watch his tutorial on this, because he's the one who taught me how to do it, and he's the one who's taught many people how to do it. And then also check out Professor Messer's video, because he's also got a really good explanation on how to do this. I think that there's a lot of good different resources, and so I'm going to link to those in the description of the video below. And I highly recommend you check those out, because learning this subject from one person, it can seem challenging, although I did try to encompass everything that I could for a cybersecurity professional to know as much as they can for this topic. I definitely think that there's other resources out there that might benefit you, maybe frame things in a way that I haven't here, and I think that it would definitely help you out in your career. So with that, I just want to say thank you so much for your time, and I hope you enjoy this video, and I hope you have a wonderful day. Thanks.